You know, Bridge, I have to say, in our space, call it what you will, nonprofit, social entrepreneurship, in my experience, there's an incredible suction of credits toward you, the organization, and you, the speaker. And everybody wants credit in our space, for good reason. And Bridge is the only guy I know that confers credits on others. He basically, he's incredibly charitable and basically gives away things that he has done, including many of the things that he's mentioned to others. So thank you for that. But Bridge and I have had the privilege of working together very closely for 7 or 8 years, and I think have done a lot together in various ways to change the malaria space globally. So the talk is entitled Harnessing the Power of Business and Entrepreneurship for Social Change. And let me just say, it's a little bit presumptuous to talk to you much about malaria and global health. It's just one, malaria is one disease, global health is just one area, and I know that all of you here represent a lot of diverse interests and backgrounds, some business, some non-business. You know, global health is a huge, intractable issue. I talked about it some yesterday. It relates to the diseases of poverty of the bottom of the pyramid, roughly 1 billion people plus who have very curtailed life expectancies and who are anticipated to die from one preventable disease or another. It could be pneumonia, it could be diarrhea, it could be tuberculosis, it could be HIV/AIDS. And when you think about social entrepreneurship, it's not a logical, natural transition to think about applying it to global health. And I think one of the remarkable things about having worked with Bridge and then this whole constellation of wonderful people that have been associated with this cause the last 10 years or so is I think it's fair to call us reluctant social entrepreneurs. I don't know about you, Bridge, and some of the people you mentioned that I'll bring up again, but when we went into this, it wasn't with a swashbuckling social entrepreneurship attitude. It was basically, here is a global, huge, intractable problem that is killing 1 million people, largely kids and pregnant women. We know that the tools exist out there. Why is it that they haven't been applied in any systematic, meaningful way? And let's do something about it. So this story I'm about to tell is how a very small group decided to do something about it, and in a very modest way, in fact, changed the world, I think, in terms of how malaria is fought. But not only malaria, but now that we recognize, Bridge, that we were and are social entrepreneurs, it really makes us feel good to apply a mindset, a methodology, a culture, and a case example, I think, of a relative success. By the way, malaria is still not totally beaten. In bracketology, I think we're in the final 16 and still making progress, but have come a long way. So my own training, just to give you a bit of my background, as Bridge was saying, is very conventional biomedical training, medicine, internal medicine, and then public health and some epidemiology, courtesy of the Centers for Disease Control. So I've been what I would call a practitioner of global health for about 12 years now, and now have 2 hats that I'd like to speak to you about today. One is board member of Malaria No More, this NGO that was founded in 2006, and second, medical director of global issues and projects for ExxonMobil Corporation. And what that means is I'm kind of the external face of the health function in ExxonMobil, and we're in about 120 some countries, have 84,000 employees, and a lot of our activities in public health relate to working with communities, countries on broad scale disease prevention and control programs around the footprint of our operations, which is largely in Africa. So the approach I'd like to take today is one of storytelling and illustrate how Malaria No More and Exxon tackled some of the world's biggest public health challenges through the prism now, the tools that we've heard the last couple of days of social entrepreneurship. So this is a retrospective analysis, because going forward, I don't think, prior to this conference, we never mentioned ourselves as social entrepreneurs, but in fact, we were, I think. So after telling you a few stories about malaria from the eyes of a practitioner, then I'd like to circle back. There's a huge amount of very, very important academic and scholarly literature on social entrepreneurship. So being a closeted academic, and I knew I would be coming to be with you, I actually read a fair amount of the published academic literature, which was really quite fascinating and highly relevant. So at the end of my talk, I'd like to come back and retrofit some things that you have perhaps studied and know already and reality tested against the models of what we really did as kind of bumbling, ignorant people going forward. And let me just actually get to my bottom line. After having read the academic background and after having been a practitioner in the field and being around the world a few hundred times, including Africa, to see how this stuff is done and who does it, I actually think that social entrepreneurs are born and not made. This is a very small, hardy breed of people that have incredible drive, will not take no for an answer, and they look at every barrier and every bottleneck as a potential opportunity. And the story of malaria, in many ways, is the turning around of historically intractable barriers that are human barriers. They're not biologic barriers, human barriers where we couldn't get our act together. And lo and behold, with some serious SCs over the last few years, we've pretty much gotten it together and have surmounted most of the barriers. So let me talk about some of these champions. Previously we called them champions, now they're social entrepreneurs. So Ray Chambers and Peter Chernin, that Bridge alluded to. So Ray was from Newark, New Jersey, grew up in a self-professed poor, white, lower middle class background, had the good fortune in his, I think, mid-20s to, as he puts it, stumble into Wall Street, and he and a business partner, John Simon, invented the instrument of the leveraged buyout. This was in the late 70s and early 80s, and he made a fabulous fortune and retired at the age of 35. And what did he retire to? But, and again, he didn't know the title, but he became social entrepreneur par excellence, initially focusing on the city of Newark, his birthplace and where he grew up and where he had incredibly fond, direct, emotional feelings. And Newark at that time, if you recall back in the late 70s, early 80s, was basically a bombed out hull of a city, and was had problems of governance, had problems of huge crime, issues around the inability to attract business. It basically was a city falling apart with centripetal forces just pulling it asunder from all sides. So Ray, at that point, developed a model which he subsequently applied to malaria. And you may ask, what does rehabilitating Newark by a social entrepreneur have to do with malaria? So I came up with this notion after I understood what he really did in Newark. And so he, by this point, as a wealthy philanthropist who also understood the power structure of the city and also knew how to get things done, he came up with what I call the Newark Triangle, which is in a situation that, in this case, a city that is without effective governance, without money, without public attention, without capacity, what do you do to turn things around? So he basically said, well, you need three foundations, three sides of a triangle all at the same time. You need competent governance, i.e., let's install an honest mayor who really has the good of the city in mind. Let's get the media on board that this is going to be a new venture, a new enterprise with a higher level of payout, higher level of accountability to the citizens. And let's get, most importantly, business to come in. Now that there's honest leadership, and now that there's media that's going to go off with their flashbulbs and their pens and write about us, let's bring in business, because business now has some of the preconditions that they need to invest. And lo and behold, over 10 or 15 years, this model and Ray's incredible work, both behind the scenes and in front of the cameras. He's, by the way, a very notoriously modest guy. Newark was lifted from the shadows into prominence, and it's still working on, emerging and becoming all the dreams that Ray had hoped, but it's clearly made just remarkable strides. So Ray, having finished Newark, asked himself the question, and I think Bridge was close to him at this time, in about 2005, he said, Newark was great, that was a good 20-year run. We accomplished a lot. We brought in big business. We revitalized downtown. There are huge business towers, created tons of employment, economic opportunities. We have a new professional basketball team, a new stadium, a new ice hockey team. Why don't we take care of another small problem? And this time his attention turned international and to children, but he, being a wise social entrepreneur, he wanted to assess the size and the scale of the opportunity. He wasn't going to willy-nilly throw himself into a battle until he understood the landmarks of the battlefield and the likelihood of winning this one. So he did a lot of inventorying of the malaria space, which is where I came in. At one point, I was called into his office, and here I was with a non-Italian version of a Don interviewing me about malaria. And so he said, Stephen, can we end all deaths from malaria by 2015? Okay, and this was 10 years previously. And I had worked on malaria a fair amount. And let me just tell you, malaria has been around since prehistory. In Darwinian terms, the malaria parasite is the most wily creature on the globe without any parallel. It's amazing. It just is really good at shuttling between the mosquito and man. It doesn't pay attention to insecticides. Not a whole lot to bed nets. It kind of does its own thing. All it really wants to do is reproduce and eat. It's really a wonderful little creature. And I thought some of you might identify with that. And anyway, so Ray said, what's it going to take to eliminate malaria by 2015? And I said to myself, God, this guy has got to be kidding. But I'm not going to tell him the bad news. And so it looked to me like he was embarking on a serious campaign that had killed, in round numbers, 1 million women, children a year, 85–90% in sub-Saharan Africa, but also significant foci in South and East Asia and in Latin America. And this man was, sitting in his Madison Avenue office and says, can we rub this thing out by 2015? So he was also talking to a serial SE without knowing it, and I said, well, sure, why not, Ray? And so he came up with this, in business terms, this BHAG, this big, hairy, audacious goal. So, what does it mean operationally? If you want to end malaria deaths by 2015, and this is, again, 2005 or 6, what do you need to do to accomplish this? What are the levers? How much change? How is change managed? Who are the change agents? So Ray's guidance right away was, we're going to do this on business terms, which really appealed to me. I learned my own sense of business, not in school. I went to med school. When I was going to med school, business school was anathema. It was like, that's where the people that wanted to get rich and had no social conscience would be. So that was not me. But then courtesy of ExxonMobil, which is one of the most incredibly well-managed companies on the face of the globe, they actually take very poor candidates like retread physicians and they teach you management. So I actually had reasonable management tools, courtesy of a company that just felt that being a good manager in all senses, managing money, people, projects, was something that they expected from day one, and if you weren't good enough, they were going to teach it to you. So when Ray said, we're going to use the business mindset and principles to make it happen, he had a very willing conscript in this. Totally made a lot of sense. So I and a few others then undertook this landscape analysis, diagnostics of where were we on malaria and what did we need to do to basically get to this ambitious BHAG target. So in 2005 or 6, the global health spend on the bottom billion in round numbers was $20 billion, of which about 5% or less was on malaria, which is a trifling sum. 90% of this, again in 2005, was public money. And the big donors at the time were the usual suspects. It was the World Bank, it was the Global Fund based in Geneva, it was the Gates Foundation, and then a few international development agencies. So we undertook business analysis and organization design as to how would we need to organize the existing malaria community and then start something new that was going to lead this fight. And came down on the fact that there were 5 big gaps that needed to be filled to be able to meet this 2015 target. Money, political will, huge amount of public awareness and support. At this time, European and North American public awareness was very, very limited. Perhaps 10 or 20% of people on a general survey would acknowledge or know that malaria was a big global health threat. Fourth, it was clear that the current landscape around global health and malaria prevention and control was dysfunctional, and that's kind of an understated term, and that there needed to be significant reform of the existing assets fighting malaria. And fifth, and maybe most importantly, that the countries themselves that were the endemic locus of malaria needed leadership and needed capacity, mostly at the sub-Saharan Africa level, to get this done. And no amount of outside help, no matter how well intended or structured, was going to, in itself, be effective without African country-level leadership, support, and capacity. So this called on the building of a new organization, which had a wonderful name called Malaria No More. This is now 2006. And from the get-go, M&M, Malaria No More, was designed to have the competencies and the skill sets to be able to perform on this expectation. So what were those, and who were they? So media and communications was going to be key, effective political advocacy to generate political will, both in the northern countries and in the southern impacted countries, people that knew something about finance mechanisms, and finally, partnerships and deal-making. This turf of global malaria is very much of a checkerboard, very fragmented, very much driven by vertical governance issues where each NGO, each foundation. Each development agency had its own goals and targets that nary related to the more horizontal work of putting this all together into a comprehensive global plan. So this was essentially, if you recall the Newark model, Ray and his wisdom, and without calling it the Newark model, he's very modest, and so he didn't even tell us what he was up to, but he put together this Newark model, which he now called Malaria No More, brought in a guy named Peter Chernin, a name you might recognize. Peter at the time was Chief Executive Officer of News Corporation and reported to Rupert Murdoch. And he had a typical career of a Hollywood magnate. He, by the way, at that time and even now is probably the biggest Hollywood television and movie producer. He, as he humbly said, I green-lighted Titanic during one of our Malaria No More board meetings. And I said, how often do you sit at a board meeting with somebody who green-lighted Titanic? So Peter was brought in essentially as a partner to Ray in heading Malaria No More. And talking about a social entrepreneur, Peter, interestingly, was an English major in a small liberal arts college, an English major who didn't have the vaguest notion of what he wanted to do with an English degree out of college. And he started as a entry-level editor at Simon & Schuster. And I tell you this story as a point of inspiration for me and hopefully for many others. You know, you frequently look for very positive trajectories and ask, what is it I need to major in and do on day one, you know, to be able to have the levers to control the world? Well, here's a guy named Peter Chernin who is literally the most powerful Hollywood producer. He controlled much of the media empire of Rupert Murdoch and actually had the good sense to be elsewhere with the current crises going on, largely in London. But anyway, he parlayed a modest English degree and not a lot of global ambition into being in a position where not only did he have tremendous media and entertainment assets at his control, but now took on malaria with Ray Chambers, again, with almost an identical mindset of seeing what business can do. And these guys implicitly knew that if you want to accomplish something of a global scale of this complexity and ambition, you need to have the right people in place. So the first thing they did is get John Bridgeland on board as the deputy board lead for Malaria No More, and knowing that they had a serial social entrepreneur that would be a terrier in everything that he did in terms of how to help organize the M&M effort. And then they hired a guy named Scott Case, whose name you also might recognize, who during the dot-com boom was the co-founder of Priceline.com and was a premier marketer. And so this was a very unusual organization for a malaria outfit. And so I became an early board member and had then the opportunity to see how this Newark model would be implemented for malaria. So let me, I think it would be illustrative to actually go through 3 or 4 examples of projects that Malaria No More did. Again, not so much for its own sake on malaria, but just to show you how social entrepreneurs think in terms of, opportunity, risk, and also how they actually achieve success, and also sometimes failure, how they pick themselves up. And these are all characteristics, I think, that are important in whatever field you apply it to, but again, best demonstrated through a few case examples. So one early project was the one that that Bridge mentioned, which was going in, a survey was done, and a public survey of how much Americans knew about malaria, just to establish a baseline. And as I said before, it came back with very disappointing results. That basically malaria was not known by the average American as anything that would impact not only them, but potentially anybody else in the world. So there then became a very, very structured, avowed plan to do something about this. And so Peter Chernin, in one of his media assets was Fox Television. The premier asset of Fox Television was American Idol. So Peter went to American Idol and said, have we thought about a special promotional program that will enhance our ratings, establish our credibility as a franchise that we do more than find incredible pop talent and develop them, but we also use the pop talent, leverage the talent to provide awareness and support for some major causes related to poverty, both in Africa and in the US. So essentially the first program of Idol Gives Back, IGB, was launched in 2008. ExxonMobil was the premier corporate sponsor. We sponsored it to the tune of $10 million. Malaria No More was named as one of the 5 or 6 charity beneficiaries. And perhaps most importantly, there were 2 or 3 segments on the Idol show that were shot in Angola, and I had the privilege of going to Angola with Idol stars. And by the way, I had never seen Idol to that point, but I had these wonderful, bouncy, smart, talented teenagers to lead around Angola, which was quite a trip. And we shot film in villages. We shot film in the only pediatric hospital in the entire country. Then we went back with an actor named Forrest Whitaker, who you may know, who won the Best Actor prize at the Oscars about 3-4 years ago. And at the height of his fame, he shot great malaria segments, which were shown on Idol. Make a long story short, as Bridge said, $70+ million was raised. A good chunk of that went to malaria, and then the same thing was replicated 2 years later. Idol Gives Back 2010 was held, raised another $65 million, again put malaria on the forefront of the American psyche. And so a huge amount of money was raised, and the research then showed that 65%, I forget the exact number, of Americans had become over time aware that malaria was a significant threat. So why was this important? Well, I think the notion is that our elected officials, our political leadership, is very sensitive to what the electorate thinks. And so the notion of mobilization of public awareness and support of malaria then subsequently played well on the Hill, played well in a number of major decision-making forums. So this whole idea was more than just a flash in the pan. It was more than fireworks. This had a long-term vision associated with it. Second example of social entrepreneurship attacking intractable obstacles. The single biggest funder of global health problems in the world is called the Global Fund. I think many of you have probably heard about it. It's called the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. It's based in Geneva. It's a Swiss foundation. It is predominantly funded by the G8 governments and dispenses somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 billion a year for global health. It's hugely important. It's by far the biggest 800-pound gorilla on the global health block. We looked very closely at how much it was funding malaria out of its big pot, and the answer was too little. And why was it funding too little? It's because the mechanism by which the Global Fund disperses money is that it responds to country need. It's all country driven. So if you're in a highly malarious country like Nigeria, where you're losing hundreds of thousands of people to malaria, the way you get money for malaria is you apply to the Global Fund. And the application has to fulfill a whole bunch of requisites in terms of technical soundness, managerial soundness, measuring results. You don't get the money unless you prove to be a good steward of that money and will handle it in a responsible way. Well, Nigeria, DRC, a whole bunch of other countries could not do that, would not do that. Consequently, they weren't getting malaria grants. So Ray and Peter stroked their chin, and they said, you know, this is really not good, and it's also remediable. So came up with a strategy of getting consultants, very competent technical consultants, typically from northern countries, to parachute in on, again, a structured and systematic way to as many as 15 countries in Africa and work with the ministries of health and work with the country malaria control program managers to put together sound award applications to the Global Fund. And this happened year after year after year because the Global Fund has annual planning cycles. And lo and behold, within 2 years, the malaria grant approval success rate went from 20% to 65%. The upfront investment in this whole program was somewhere between $1 and $2 million a year. The reward, the payout from this program was hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So for instance, ExxonMobil funded this technical support to the countries that we operate in, which is Nigeria, Angola, Cameroon, Chad. And so we funded $1 million over 2 or 3 years and got a payout of $180 million of Global Fund money going directly to the governments of those countries. That's a pretty good return on investment. Would you call that social entrepreneurship? Hard to say. It's not a classical model, but it's an interesting one. So over the past 8 years, the Global Fund has now, via this mechanism I just described, has funded 160 million nets and 170 million anti-malarial treatments to go out to the field, and still counting as we go. Third example of how do you look at an intractable problem and turn it around to an opportunity that you can actually fix. So that would be the bed net supply chain bottleneck. So without belaboring this could be a MBA course lasting 2 years in itself, the entire issue around how do you get bed nets, which are a life-saving intervention that costs about $5. How do you get it from manufacturer to distributor to retailer to the end user, and how do you get it actually hung and used at the dwelling level in the villages? So the more Ray and Peter saw about how this worked, the more they, not only were they disappointed, I think they had smoke coming out of their ears, because everything about this supply chain was counterintuitive. Almost none of it worked. And when you actually took some metrics, it would take 18 to 24 months to get a bed net into a village from the moment that the Global Fund actually approved it and funded it. 18 to 24 months. So they said this is just unacceptable, and developed a variety of mechanisms to debottleneck this whole inefficient and dysfunctional value chain. But first and foremost, they came up with a mechanism, being financiers, called the Net Guarantee Program, which essentially is a insurance program that indemnifies the Global Fund for money that they've already approved, but they haven't dispersed to the country, which is a big bottleneck that takes about 6 months. So a third party, like a commercial bank or an insurer, now actually pays the money to the country once a Global Fund grant is approved, knowing that eventually the Global Fund would indemnify those funds in due course. And so this essentially was a fairly simple financial mechanism to just speed up the slowness of the financial disbursement process of the fund. And we just heard this is kind of a pilot test, but just recently the country of Mozambique had 250,000 nets flowing in 6 months rather than the usual 18 months. So cutting 12 months out of the time for the supply chain to work. The fourth gap was the problem of people receiving these nets in the villages and not hanging them up in the dwellings over where they sleep. And in some studies, only about a quarter to a half of nets that were delivered were actually hung in the dwellings. So that's a tough problem, and there's no single one-stop fix. But Malaria No More had incredible ability in the social media and in the mass mobilization arena. They had a lot of knowledge, northern knowledge, that has never been applied in Africa. So they came up with a very clever campaign called Night Watch, which was based on a public service announcement that many of you might remember in the US that played on television and radio some 10, 15 years back, saying it's 10 p.m., do you know where your children are? So this was replicated in 4 countries in Africa, and via television, radio, and SMS messaging, a countrywide blitz was made every night at 9 p.m., which was more appropriate to the biting time of the mosquito, which is, it's 9 p.m. Are you and your family safe under a mosquito bed net? So we don't know the result, and this is obviously very much of a result-seeking world, but there are studies going on in these 4 countries, Chad, Cameroon, Tanzania, and Senegal, that are going to measure the bed net usage rate relative to before, which was dismally low, to see what impact this campaign is having. So again, this is not a panacea, but it shows you what kind of clever, innovative thinking and existing technology can do to mobilize people that previously were silent. No one cared about them. This was just not done. So looking at M&M, I can just conclude that that they really have a singular social entrepreneurial model among health NGOs, and I think provide a case example that social entrepreneurs can come from any sector and can leverage government, nonprofit, commercial resources to meet common goals with greater efficiency. And it's kudos to the vision and the execution ability of people like Peter and Ray and John Bridgeland and Scott Case. I think that we have these examples and that we have made a huge dent in malaria in the last 7 or 8 years. Let me just turn a little bit to ExxonMobil and play my own role of kind of the unwilling or reluctant social entrepreneur, because dovetailing with Malaria No More, ExxonMobil had a similar set of experiences in malaria, but done on a multinational corporate basis and not on an NGO basis. So put yourself back in the year 2000 when Exxon and Mobil merged. At that point, the two became the single largest public oil and gas, integrated oil and gas company in the world. And I had the role of being the medical director initially for both companies, which was largely an administrative job, and basically managing fairly big budget, a fair number of people in about 80 countries, providing occupational health services to, at that point, 140,000 employees throughout the world. But my heart wasn't in it. I really liked public health. I really thought there was an unmet need in Africa, especially that my skill set and my personal will and sense of self dictated me to move toward. And the question was, how do I get this supertanker to change directions and try to do something about public health in Africa? And as you guys know, it's really easy to turn a supertanker. And so I came up with the notion, based on a business driver. As part of the transition team managing the merging of the two companies, I had access to privileged inside information, and I saw that the investment plan over the decade of 2000 and 2010 would make ExxonMobil one of the largest foreign direct investors in Africa, if not the largest, and that Africa was scheduled to be, forecast to be, responsible for 12% of the growth of oil and gas resources in the world in that decade, which that proved out as a forecast. So I said to myself, this is the biggest area of growth for this new company. It's going to be investing tens of billions of dollars. It is in a area that has some of the poorest health indicators in the world. How do I make that relevant to my company? And so the answer was I stitched together the story, which the biology and the epidemiology of malaria and HIV/AIDS really helped, which is these diseases do not respect fence lines. Exxon's first legitimate concern is its employees for a number of reasons, but high-cost employees that are really invaluable in terms of technical and managerial skill sets that are going to be responsible for getting incredible amounts of oil and gas out of the ground. These people are really valuable, and 90% of them are local nationals. They're not expatriates. So how do you assess the risk and manage the risk from these scourge infectious diseases? And so on a risk assessment matrix, HIV/AIDS and malaria popped out as the highest probability, highest impact diseases facing ExxonMobil, and it was comparable to security risk and political risk in this multidimensional matrix analysis. So took that as an opportunity to talk to our leadership and asked, had you ever considered the issues of infectious diseases, and specifically malaria and HIV/AIDS, as it relates to the operability, the license to operate, and the ability to operate in Africa? And the answer was no. I mean, these are very competent managers and technocrats, and their job is to get very tough projects done in very, very adverse, inclement environments. And their job is not to figure out what unanticipated problem is going to essentially get in our way. So I made the case in Dallas that this was going to get in your way, and was successful in getting a response of very untraditional response for ExxonMobil, which is let's pilot a program not inside the fence line, but outside the fence line, recognizing that malaria and HIV/AIDS had huge components outside the fence line. They asked me to pilot a program that would look at working with local governments, international NGOs and donors, implementers, on how to do country-scale malaria prevention and control programs. And eventually this built up to be a $15 million a year program where I had the privilege of being an ambassador to the outside world and then working with Malaria No More, working with probably 20 or 30 partners, stitching together deals that would bring major finance and major implementation capacity to various countries in Africa on malaria. And this was all about operationalizing public-private partnerships. It was not about check writing. The budget was used exclusively, essentially, to get ExxonMobil to the table, and then we had pay to play, but then we played with much, much bigger players that were centrally in the global health space, like the World Bank and the regional development banks and the Global Fund and so on and so forth. So let me give you a couple examples of what we accomplished under the ExxonMobil banner, just to give you another side of social entrepreneurship in action. So you heard from Ali Siddiqui yesterday, which is one of the landmark projects that everybody has had a hand in and appropriately takes credit for, which is the establishment of the first long-lasting bed net manufacturing capacity in Africa. So let me back up and give you kind of a macro view. So in 2003, when malaria was running rampant in Africa, bed nets, which were touted by the World Health Organization as one of the 2 or 3 major fixes, were manufactured exclusively in Asia, in places like Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand, and then delivered to Africa. There was not a single manufacturing site for long-lasting nets in Africa. And people were saying, and not business people, but public health people were saying, you know, gee, aren't there logistics and distribution advantages to having African manufacture? I mean, it just stands to reason in terms of basic logic that rather than shipping all the way from South or East Asia, you could have economies of scale in the supply chain, in distribution. And so I initially sat down with representatives from the World Bank and with WHO to try to work out a mechanism whereby long-lasting nets could be manufactured in Africa. And this took 3 years to put together, but we structured a deal that Ali referred to that involved 6 different players with 6 different roles to put a bednet manufacturing plant in Arusha, Tanzania. And the 6 players were WHO, UNICEF, Sumitomo, ExxonMobil, Acumen, which Ali represented, and PSI, which is a social marketing NGO. And to make a long story short, it is now probably the case example, not only in the malaria field, but in the Africa economic development field, is one of the premier successes. You heard from Ali. It's up and running. It's making money. It's fully sustainable in that sense. It employs 7,000 people in Tanzania, which is, interestingly, the 2nd largest employer in the country behind the government. Most of the employees are women who work in fabricating the nets, and the company offers food and housing for those who need it and education for all the children of the women. So it's an incredible Africa development success story. It also now produces 30 million bed nets a year, which is roughly 1/3 or so of the need of all of Africa. And the second example, and again, we think small scale at ExxonMobil. I became appointed to the board of Rollback Malaria. Rollback Malaria is an international consortium based in Geneva of about 250 to 300 players who have something to do with malaria: nonprofits, host governments, donor governments, academic organizations, anybody and everybody that has a stake in global malaria research or control is there. Because it's such a big, unwieldy organization that had very few ground rules, it was unfortunately dysfunctional. And one of the notions I had on becoming a board member was, you know, is United Nations reform possible? And I didn't realize that there was others had come before me that had this this grand narcissistic thought. So I didn't know that the answer was no, you can't reform UN agencies. So I said, this is, after sitting through another totally inane board meeting where everybody ranted and complained and there was no purposive action of this, again, this group of 250 players, all of whom nominally were in the same boat and wanted to see global progress, I said, this needs really a structural fix. So I got enough support from within the board to move on this, and we developed the terms of reference for change called the Change Initiative. We then took up funding for an outside management consultancy to come in and help us on a year-long effort. The Boston Consulting Group was hired. We raised $3.5 million from the board members, member constituencies. They had the willingness to pay to fix themselves, which is a good way to start. This was not externally imposed. And to make a long story short, over a year, we reformed RBM. Now, it's not a pristine, monolithic, well-oiled machine, but it's got a functioning board. It has a functioning secretariat. It now produces infinitely more on-the-ground progress. It produces great reports on results. It has attracted media attention. It has been singled out as the most efficient global health consortium now, and others like tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS are looking to roll back malaria as kind of the model agency of how an international group ought to work. So that's the second example I wanted to regale you with. So earlier I promised, and this is sort of toward the wind-up, I promised an academic treatment of the role and power of business entrepreneurship for social change. So now let me put on my professorial hat. Not long after the founding of William and Mary and the colonies, in London, a guy named Adam Smith declared in his Wealth of Nations, "I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affection, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it." But a business enterprise, he goes on to say, does not have to be a social enterprise to improve social conditions. As he points out, businesses frequently serve the public good without having the specific intent to do so. So now, well into the 21st century, over 200 years since Adam Smith penned these words, his wisdom on this matter is being challenged by social entrepreneurs who are deliberately using business ventures to serve the public good. So with our Malaria No More and ExxonMobil case examples in mind, how do we convert business entrepreneurs to social entrepreneurs? Putting it another way, in a world with sectoral boundaries blurring, how can business ideas be applied to advantage in the social sector? For social entrepreneurs, the social mission is explicit and central, and mission-related impact becomes the central criterion, not wealth creation. Wealth is just a means to an end for social entrepreneurs. So let me conclude by offering a model initially developed by academic named J. Gregory Dees, who some of you may know, who was then at Stanford School of Business and now is at Duke, to look at some of the salient characteristics of how business skills are harnessed by the successful social entrepreneur. He has developed this model of social entrepreneurship, and he says that they play the role of change agent in the social sector by 5 criteria: adopting a mission to create and sustain social value, not just private value. So in the case examples we reviewed earlier, the social value would be ending malaria deaths by 2015. The social value, by the way, has tremendous economic value. The Commission on Macroeconomics and Health calculated that malaria is a $12 billion per annum drag on the sub-Saharan Africa economy. So in this case, social value also clearly generates economic value, but it's not the primary driver. Second, recognizing and relentlessly pursuing new opportunities to serve that mission. So relentless is a word that has to be in your lexicon if you have the hubris to attack malaria. Malaria, again, has been around since time immemorial. I think Darwin would predict that it's the most successful example of parasite adaptation. It fights insecticides. It fights drugs in terms of resistance. It's incredibly wily, so we have to be relentless. Another key trait of the social entrepreneur. Third is engaging in a process of continuous innovation, adaptation, and learning. Fourth, very important, acting boldly without being limited by resources currently in hand. So the resources currently in hand in 2000 for malaria were $50 million. That's really a drop in the bucket. I mean, that's really not even worth branding a single campaign around. That has grown, that 50 million has grown to about $2 billion. So that's a 44-fold increase in the last 10 years. And hopefully, even in this adverse economic environment, it will not shrink, and we're looking forward to still further growth. But if anybody had been stymied by lack of resources in hand early on, nothing would have been accomplished. And finally, exhibiting heightened accountability to the constituencies served and for the outcomes created. So Malaria No More, with strong support from ExxonMobil, has created global and country metrics for measuring progress. There's now a scorecard that it's on the internet, that has global play, that's owned by African leadership, African heads of state. They own their own cell in the scorecard, and it's a tremendous inducement for accountability, and not to mention competition among African states. So finally, let me say how fortunate I think all of you are in the audience, especially the undergrads and the business students who have a dean and a faculty here that supports the social entrepreneurship mission. You're really, really lucky. And in a rare environment, I think some of us who were going through our educational tracks didn't have the benefit of this, and I think arguably we could have leveraged a lot more of our perspicacity and talent earlier had we had the benefit of what you're having. So kudos to the faculty here for their wisdom in staging not only this event, but running a program on entrepreneurship in the long term.